Welcome to the Let Me Be Free podcast. My name is Jackie.
And my name is Alwyn.
We're two sisters from Ireland living in Australia, navigating our healing journeys together, and this is our podcast, Let Me Be Free.
Welcome back to the Let Me Be Free podcast. This is Alwyn. This podcast episode is going to be a follow-up about my son being kicked out of daycare. The recent episode that we recorded, it just didn't feel right to me. I didn't feel like I was there. I didn't feel like myself, even recording it. It was as if I was talking completely from my mind and not from my heart. And I realized since that it was because I hadn't fully accepted it. I haven't fully accepted how much I was struggling and how much my son was struggling and how fragile I felt, how broken, how wounded, how terrified I was. And so in the last episode, it just didn't feel right for me because I wasn't speaking from my heart, which is, that's where I operate from. It's from my rawness, it's from my pain, it's from my depths that I record these podcasts. It's the whole point of it. I'm not a fact checker. I'm not good with facts. I'm good with speaking from the heart. And I wasn't speaking from the heart. And that just didn't feel right to me. And so this episode is going to be talking about, I guess, the deeper sides of what has been happening and also just sharing my experience and what I've learned on a deeper level. From after the podcast, I remember listening back to a little bit of it and I was disappointed in myself because I was like, why do I sound like that? I don't sound like me. What's going on? And since then, I've really become more acutely aware of how much I have been struggling and how I haven't wanted to accept that. And I realized that it comes back to the time when I had my first mental breakdown. I realized that 4 years ago when my world collapsed and I fell to pieces, my pain was so visceral. I was so helpless. I felt so powerless. I felt so much responsibility because I had my two little boys with me that it was just this pit of loneliness. And, the people that I needed to save me from the pain, save the kids from me, they weren't able to do that because they were in their own experience. My husband was surviving. He couldn't be there for my pain. He couldn't open himself up to my pain because to open himself up to my pain was to open himself up to his own pain. And if he had opened himself to his own pain, then he wouldn't have been able to stay going to work, to be there for the kids in some ways. And he would have fallen to pieces with me. And so in order to survive and in order to stick beside me, he had to disconnect fully from me, to turn away from my pain, to turn away from my drowning, because his highest self knew that was the only way he was going to get through. It was the only way that he was going to be able to keep our family moving forwards while I fell apart. And for me, that felt like an abandonment, At that time, I felt so helpless and so hopeless that I needed and I wanted desperately someone to save me. I wanted someone to save the kids from me. And it just felt like everyone turned away from the depths of my pain. It was like when people looked at me and they saw how much pain I was in, how much I was suffering, it was just as if they couldn't look at me for too long. It was as if I was, had an infectious disease that people were going to catch. And so, the people I loved were doing the best that they could do with the amount of tools and resources and trauma that they had. But from my perception back then, what I realize now from these last few weeks, from Shay being kicked out of daycare, what I realize now is that I decided in that moment that we are alone. I am alone. No one is going to save me. No one is going to protect the kids. No one is going to protect the kids from me. They are not safe. And the visceral feeling of being so helpless and so powerless was so much that I swore to myself, that I promised myself that I would be strong, that I would get through it, that I wouldn't ask for help, that I wouldn't need help, because it felt like asking for help was what caused most of my pain. Asking for help and not receiving it in the way that I perceived I needed felt so profoundly painful that I took that as an even bigger wound, as an even bigger pain and a bigger suffering within me. And so I realized that, back then, I just saw myself. People looked at me and they turned away from me when they saw my pain. They couldn't look at me because to look at me was to look in the depths of their own pain. And what I perceived that to be was, no one wants me when I'm broken. No one wants me when I'm in pain. No one cares when I'm falling to pieces. They want me to be strong. People need me to be their light. People need me to be strong. People need me to keep going because my pain causes everyone else pain. My suffering causes everyone else suffering. And so I made this vow to myself, and I only realize that now. I made that vow to myself that I will never need anyone again. I will never need anyone to help me. I will do it all on my own. And of course, there's been so many people that have helped me along the way. There are so many people who have been there for me and held me up. And as my husband has healed, he also has been there. He also has been able to be with my pain more. But I realize now that none of that ever mattered because I decided that time when I had that mental breakdown that only I was going to be able to catch me. And so I could never, ever fall again. And that's a big ask. It's a big expectation to have of yourself. To never allow yourself to be fragile or to be vulnerable or to perceive yourself in your fragility and in your vulnerability as purely weak, pathetic, not good enough. And so I've wondered since that time, it's years gone by now. And, I've dug through every single morsel of pain inside of me. I have dug and I have searched and I have excavated, looking for every bit of pain that's in there. I couldn't move forward. I couldn't live a life. I couldn't enjoy my life. I couldn't be with my kids. I couldn't take care of myself in the way that I so desperately wanted to take care of myself because I needed to make sure that I was never blindsided again the way I was back then. I went from being functioning and normal to being collapsed on the ground, unable to function, hurting my children, and no one was there to save me or them. And I had to prepare myself. I needed to make sure that I looked for every single thing that was wrong with me. I needed to make sure that I found every single ache and every single pain and every single trauma and every single wound, so that I would never, ever be that vulnerable again. I would never, ever be that fragile again, because no one was going to catch me. No one was ever going to catch me. It was just me and my boys. And that was how I perceived that experience. Now, of course, I can understand it from a completely different perspective. Now I know that what happened had to happen. I would never have saw my own strength if my husband and my sister were able to swoop in and fix everything for me. I would never have been able to develop the depths of power, the depths of connection. I wouldn't be able to hold space for others to the depths that I hold space for them now if I hadn't had to find my own way through. So I know now, and I can understand now, that everything had to happen exactly as it happened. But it didn't change the belief system that I've carried since then. Every time that I tried to move forward, every time I tried to walk forward into life, to live, to be free, I would always be yanked back by this cord, yanked back to see something else that needed to be fixed. It's like this part of me, the part of me that was one day normal and the next day broken. That part of me kept yelling at me every time I tried to move forward, every time I tried to live a life, every time I tried to find joy. That part was like that elastic band that would yank me back and say, no, you can't do that. You can't move forward. You haven't fixed everything. You haven't found everything. You can fall to pieces again. Who's going to catch you? You're not done yet. You're not fixed yet. You got to keep healing. Don't live. Don't move on. You can't move on until you're fixed. And I think it's been a prison. That belief system has imprisoned me in a life that has been very painful these last few years. So much. I deserve so much joy and I deserve so much happiness. But I've been so afraid of falling. So afraid of showing any weakness or any fragility that I had to be constantly fixing myself, constantly prepared for myself to collapse at any moment, prepared to protect my kids. And that's been the hardest thing. My kids were the catalyst. My kids were the catalyst for the depths of pain that I suffered, the depths of the breakdown that I experienced. And I know a lot of people say that when you have a mental breakdown or when you're a child, nothing can be worse than what you've experienced as a child. You know, you can make it through anything. Nothing can be worse than what you experienced as a child, whether that's abuse or emotional neglect or whatever that may be. But I do agree in many ways, but also I don't agree because that period of time where I had all of that pain resurface and I had these beautiful little boys to take care of and I felt so helpless to protect them from me. There is no and has been no greater pain or suffering that I have ever or could ever experience in my life again. There will be nothing worse than that. And so I had to prevent that from happening, even if that meant I didn't live a day until I fixed all of me, kept diving deeper. There's more, there has to be more. I can't be blindsided by that pain. And so why this is all coming up now is being around my boys is always the trigger and the catalyst. I always fear my own fragility when I'm with them because they were the catalyst. Always trying to prepare to make sure that they were happy, to make sure that everything was perfect so that they didn't send me into that vulnerable, fragile, pathetic, weak state that I once was in, because no one's going to catch me. And then we started having issues with my son's daycare. And little by little, this strength started chipping away. That strong exterior started to break. I don't need help. I don't need help. I don't need anyone. I can do this all on my own. And then they were talking about, homeschooling and would I homeschool? And I felt so much shame in my body for not being able to say, yes, I can take my boy who's struggling. I can keep him at home and I can love him. And I can make sure that he's safe. But I couldn't say that. I felt terrified at the idea of having my little boy home all of the time. Terrified of my own vulnerability, my own fragility. Terrified of that monster coming back and me falling into an abyss and no one catching me. And then he got kicked out of daycare and, he was sent home to me, and my other son was on school holidays. And day by day, I started falling. And I could recognize it and I could feel it. The strength that I had built up started to crumble. I just felt hopeless again. And my youngest son, I didn't even really acknowledge and I couldn't accept how hard it was. Because to accept how hard it was to accept the possibility that I was really struggling. And to accept the possibility that I was closer to that point, that mental breakdown, than I was comfortable with. I had to do it alone. I had to keep going. And so I didn't even tell my husband. I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't telling my sister, my husband. I didn't tell anyone how much I was struggling because I could barely accept it myself. I just kept going, kept finding a way through. And so all of that became the catalyst for all of these truths to be realized within myself. Because I do need help. And, I had applied for the play therapist for my youngest son. But I know in truth, energetically, I didn't want it. I didn't want anyone's help. I didn't want anyone else to be involved. It was just me and the boys. I needed to survive. I needed to get through. I needed to be strong for me and them. No one can help me. And even if I did allow anyone to help me, I would only let them in a certain point. And then I would push them away again. Never getting too dependent on another person, because that would allow them to abandon me or fail me when they saw the depths of my brokenness and the depths of my pain. And so I had the group, and I had all of these places where I could share my pain, but from the perspective of I'm through it, always showing the vulnerability, but also the strength. And, it was only at the weekend where my little son had started the second daycare. And he was there for 4 hours, and already he was cursing at them. And when I went to collect him, this beautiful little daycare, it was so lovely. And I read energy. I knew the energy of the place was beautiful, and they really, really put so much love and energy and heart into this daycare. And I went to pick up my son, and I was chatting to the lady who was lovely and my son. And my son says to me, "Mom, I don't like this place. This place is rubbish." And I just felt myself crumbling. Not because he was speaking his truth, but because he was so unfiltered. And I could see the lady who worked there, and she's put so much love and attention into this place. I could see her energetically pull back and be a bit frustrated and disappointed in the fact that he had said something so blatant about their beautiful daycare. And I wanted her to see him from my view. I wanted her to see that he's just struggling, But at the same time, I realize that not everyone is going to see him through my lens. Not everyone is going to be able to see the beauty and the love and the struggle within him when what he perceives and what he shows is the opposite. And I brought him home, and he was horrendous for the next 2 days. He spent 4 hours away from me, and for 2 days he was just so difficult. And, every few minutes, it was, "I want you to get me a toy. I'm going to punch you in the face if you don't get me a toy." And I would hold my patience, and I would tell him, "I know that you're struggling. I can't let you punch me. I love you." And the constant reaffirmation, the constant face of his struggle, and my having to be there and show up and meet his needs and tell him that I love him. By the second day, I was broken. I realized, and I had to accept how hard this was. It's like it made me realize that I couldn't do this all on my own. It made me realize that struggling is not weakness. People can struggle because things are difficult, but it doesn't mean you're weak. I saw my inability to be constantly perfectly calm and loving and hold space for his struggles as a weakness on my part. That I wasn't strong enough, that I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't a good enough mom, that I was traumatized, that it was my trauma. And I realized as I went to the beach with him and my other son, I realized that it is not my trauma that is causing this pain inside of me right now. It is the loneliness. It is having to carry this and manage this and deal with this all on my own. And the reality is my husband had said to me that, he was like, we had talked a bit about a few things, and he had said to me the next day that, "I know I couldn't catch you before when you struggled. I know that I couldn't be there for you the way that you deserved, but I'm here now. I can catch you. I can help." But I realized how resistant I was to that when I was trying to suck it up and keep going and get the kids out the door. And he came over to me And he could see I was so dysregulated. And he had put his hand on my arm and he was like, Alwyn, you don't have to go. And I said to him, get your hands off me. Don't touch me. I'm going. And my reaction was so visceral, was so strong. And he got me to sit down in front of him and he said, what is it that you need? I want to help. And the tears welled in my eyes, and the anger and the grief, as I said to him, you can't help me. No one helps me. I am alone. I do this on my own. I don't want your help. I don't want anyone's help. And there was the truth. I had closed myself off from everyone because I was so terrified of falling again and no one catching me. Even though I have so many people around me that love me so much. I have so many people around me that would show up in a minute to be here with me. And yes, back then when I crumbled, I didn't have that. And yes, it was so incredibly painful. But that story no longer exists in this moment, in this time right now. Because right now, if I were to collapse, if I were to fall to pieces, the people around me could be there and they would be there. But I also don't need to fall to pieces. So often it's the fear of something happening that creates the pain, not the thing itself. The fear of, if we believe that if I lost my child, I would die, I wouldn't be able to breathe. If your constant mantra, your constant thought patterns are surrounding something in fear, like the fear of losing a child, then we are going to try and manipulate everything around us in order to cushion that, in order to make sure that that never happens. But that ends up, we suffocate our children. We are so afraid of losing them that we suffocate not only ourselves, but we suffocate them. We become imprisoned in our own fear. And it's the imprisonment in our own fear that is actually worse than the experience itself. And that's what I've been experiencing. My son being kicked out of daycare brought me to the point where I had to re-experience the edge of my mental breakdown. I had to go back to that place so that I could heal this wound, because I don't let anyone in. I don't trust them to hold me. I don't trust them to carry me. I feel as if I'm so weak and pathetic that I have to be completely the opposite. I have to be strong, have to show that I'm wise, have to show that I've got it all covered, so that I fool people into believing that I'm this strong, competent person, so that I fool myself into believing I'm this strong, competent person, when in actual fact, every single day I am fucking terrified of crumbling and not being caught. But as my husband says, that's the old story. And it's the story that is keeping me locked in the past. I realized that I can't move forward when I'm stuck in the past. And right now, I'm stuck in the past. I have been stuck in the past ever since that moment I collapsed. I have been trying to fix something that's not even broken. Of course, there will be times when I struggle. Everyone struggles. But it's my fear of falling and not being caught, my fear of turning into that monster and hurting my kids again and no one protecting them from me, that is what has imprisoned me and imprisoned my whole family in this life of constant circular healing with no out. Because there was no path out until I fixed everything, until I knew for sure and for certain that I would never, ever, ever fall again. But now I have to rewrite that story and help myself understand that it is okay to ask for help. It is okay to lean on people outside of me. It is okay to fall, because there are people who can catch me. But most of all, I can catch myself. I am strong enough. I am not that girl that I was. I am powerful enough. And it is okay to live. It's okay to move forward. It's okay to be free. And so I needed to, I'm sorry that this is a bit long, but I really needed to do this podcast episode because I needed to share what was in my heart, share the truth of what has been happening and what is happening within me. I listened to something really interesting 2 days ago, which really helped with this. And, it was a Teal Swan video. And she said she never does energetic updates, but she did an energetic update on what we're experiencing right now. And she said, she was saying, if you feel like you're in an oven and you're being cooked, she said, we are all being faced with essentially our greatest fears. We are all being faced with or whatever it is that we are avoiding within ourselves. And I remember thinking, what is my greatest fear? What is it that I am most afraid of? And straight away I knew my biggest fear is having a mental breakdown again. My biggest fear is falling to pieces. And as the last few days kind of unfolded, I realized that my greatest fear wasn't falling to pieces. My greatest fear was falling to pieces and not being caught. Of being alone in my suffering. Of not being prepared for my brokenness like I was back then. And it's only in knowing what we are avoiding, it's only in knowing what we are resisting within ourselves that we can then become free of it. So, this is me for today. Thanks so much everyone for listening. And if you feel like you are in an oven right now and you're being cooked at high temperatures, know that you're not alone. And I think we're just walking through the dark periods of what we're not wanting to accept within ourselves, not wanting to see within ourselves, not wanting to feel. So over now.
Thanks so much for tuning in today, guys. If you haven't done so already, please join our Facebook group, Let Me Be Free, The Wounded Inner Child, and post either anonymously or not what's going on for you in your world. We'd also be delighted if you would share this podcast or the Facebook group with one person who you think would benefit from the information. Be alone, Mahaguf. Have a beautiful day.